Okay, so Natalie, you have to talk to us about tempo and mode of evolution. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I want to start by apologizing for the length of my talk. I had recorded my talk already, and then I saw that it was only 15 minutes. And then I had sent it in already, and then I was in doubt of having to make you redo all of that because I know that was also time consuming. But in any case, I do apologize for the length of my talk. And I'm going to be trying to talk much more briefly. I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Nathalie Gontier. I'm at the Lisbon University in the Faculty of Science in Portugal. And one of the things that I want to talk with you about is the question of contingency versus convergence. As we all know, how it has been introduced with the discussion raised by Stephen G. Gould and Simon Conway Morris. And one of the questions there was if we would rewind the tape of life as it has evolved on Earth, would we come to the same survivors or not? And that is a question about whether or not there is some kind of linearity or directionality in how evolution proceeds. And I find it a very interesting discussion, but I want to think about ways of thinking about evolution in universal terms in a different way. So one of the things that I've been engaged in is I have been looking into how evolutionary biologists define evolution, and then how these definitions have been used by people working in the sociocultural sciences, in linguistics, in anthropology, and how they have, for example, applied terms such as natural selection to study cultural evolution or to study linguistic evolution. And then in that regard, that associates with what is known within philosophy of biology as the units and levels of evolution debates. And the question there then is, can we go from there to thinking about how evolution would not only evolve in life, in biology, but also in culture, and also perhaps in outer space. And so my talk is about three different mechanisms that are thought to be universal in evolution. One of them is natural selection, the other one is punctuated equilibria, and the other one is reticulation. And so, what is universal Darwinism? Universal Darwinism is the idea that natural selection theory can be applied to different domains, not only to the study of anatomical form, but also to the study of behavior in animals, or the study of molecular evolution with Manfred Eigen's hypercycle theory, for example. Also, the evolution of languages and even the evolution of the universe has been conceptualized as something that evolves by means of natural selection. In regard to perhaps it's better to see like that. In regard to punctuated equilibria is a pattern of evolution that says that evolution can occur at different paces. So you can have rapid evolution and also periods of stasis. And that pattern now has been found also in the archaeological record and also in the hominin record and in language evolution. So there also that is something that is probably universal on Earth, not only in biology, but also in sociocultural and linguistic sciences, and so perhaps also on other planets. And then reticulate evolution is evolution as it occurs by means of symbiosis, hybridization, lateral gene transfer in biology. But there also we can think about reticulation as something that occurs in the sociocultural sciences and in the linguistic sciences, linguistic phenomena, cultural phenomena also demonstrate these forms of reticulation. So you have aspects such as multiculturalism or cultural blending that can be a form of reticulation, or also transhumanism. It's a form of reticulate evolution. And so one of the things then that we have to do is we have to cope with this form of intergalactic diversity. So with the rise of the theorizing on the nature of an extended evolutionary synthesis, and also with other ways of thinking about evolution, we have to recognize that there are different mechanisms out there, and then these different mechanisms are probably, if they occur on other planets, then we need to take into account that life can evolve reticulately, that it will have different phases of evolution, and that selectionism is probably also something that is universal. So that is basically my talk. Stop share. Okay. I tried to be very quick this time.
Can I? You're
Carlos?
muted.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And I think when I speak next, like if people agree with you, they'll agree with me. So that's nice. But I wanted to ask about these three general features you speak of evolution: principle of natural selection, punctuated equilibrium, and reticulation. And in particular, I'm interested in what makes them universal, right? Because the two of them, or well, all three of them are patterns. One of them has a mechanism that is explanatory, that explains why the pattern arises. And the other two, you can come up with mechanisms for why the pattern arises, but it's not immediately obvious, right? So for punctuated equilibrium, maybe it's allopatric speciation is the way species speciate. And because of that, you're going to see long periods of stasis followed by very quick change. For reticulation, maybe it just has to do with there's lots of good genetic material goodies out there, and creatures like to gobble them up and incorporate them. But I can imagine other mechanisms, and so I wanted to probe your thoughts as to what you thought underlied those patterns.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So there is indeed a distinction between patterns of evolution and between mechanisms that then explain those patterns. And in many ways, natural selection theory has been associated with a pattern of descent with modification. But in many ways, descent with modification is also something that is brought forth by mechanisms that cause reticulate evolution. So reticulate evolution is basically a pattern where you see the crossing of lineages, but then the crossing of lineages can occur through mechanisms such as hybridization, symbiogenesis, lateral gene transfer. Lateral gene transfer itself is something that happens through a variety of processes and mechanisms. So there is indeed a distinction there. And that is something that I've been studying, that I've been finding very interesting. So when people implement evolutionary thinking in the sociocultural sciences, in the linguistic sciences, they go for these patterns. And then they say, well, we have the same pattern, so it must be that mechanism that is active there. So for example, if you see descent with modification in cultural artifacts, then anthropologists will tell you that those ones that adhere to evolutionary thinking, they will tell you, well, you see, there is selection going on of cultural artifacts. And they base themselves there on the pattern. So if that is viable, which I think in many ways is, then we can dissociate the pattern with a specific mechanism. In many ways, if we think about natural selection, the way that it occurs in biology based on differential selection of genes, is totally different than thinking about cultural evolution as a differential selection of a cultural artifact, where you can even have some kind of directed selection and some kind of intentionality of a human being selecting some artifacts over others. But nonetheless, at the meta level, at the universal level, you can say that there is some kind of selection going on there. So in that regard, then, going one step further, and that is also what people have been doing with these universal, with these debates on the units and levels of selection, etc. Like there, for example, you can then think about the unit of selection would be the replicator here, and in any other place in the universe, if there is something evolving, there must be replicators, or there must be memes or something like that.
Okay, Neil? Did Neil?
Your
Sorry, just following up on that. Yeah, well, I'll learn eventually. Following up on that prior question, there's a really great and I think very helpful book by Peter Godfrey Smith, Darwinian Populations and Natural Selection. And the way I like the way he conceptualizes it, that there are several different dimensions along which you can use the selectionist talk, and some entities rate highly along one dimension and rate poorly along other dimensions. But so I recommend that book. But just in general, yeah, I am kind of skeptical about the ability to apply selectionist thinking this broadly in the kind of ambitious way that you and many others, have set forth. It's a metaphysical thing. I just don't think there's the bearers are really out there.
Well, yeah, so if you look into the history of how that happened, in the beginning you had sociobiology. And so for many sociobiologists, implementing evolutionary thinking meant implementing selectionist thinking, and that then meant looking for a gene for a certain kind of behavior. As the early ethologists did, they looked, for example, for the genetic basis of certain types of behavior. And there was a stage in the history of science where people started to think about a gene for this kind of behavior or a module in the brain for another kind of behavior, but these were never found. So I think now there's a different way of thinking about this in a universal way, but that of course also in many ways demystifies selection. For example, if you can say that natural selection occurs in biology and in cultural evolution and in linguistic evolution without the necessity of genes or anything, then that also says something about natural selection at the biological level being only one type of selection. So it is not longer the prototype by which natural selection occurs. I don't know if that point is like coming across.
That addresses, no, that's fine.
Catherine.
Thanks for an interesting talk, Natalie. I just wanted to come at this from the archaeological side a little bit and just say that in my experience in anthropology and archaeology, we think a little bit differently about cultural traits, and we tend not to emphasize natural selection. I mean, there's always a sector in any discipline who emphasizes a different part, but we tend to think a little bit more in terms of the other mechanisms that can explain change over time, whether that's the equivalent to drift, founder effect, this kind of stuff. And partly that's, especially for the really ancient cultural traditions, it's because of the small size of populations. So if we're talking, for example, about the Acheulean tradition, which you mentioned, it's true, there's kind of an ostensible stasis, but that's partly a matter of definition and lack of resolution. So there was a lot of local variation, but again, because human populations were so small, you don't see kind of a wholesale shift into the next stage of technology. And plus we have all these very unfortunate sample effects. And so, preservation biases as well. So it's widely been supposed that Acheulean technology being relatively static means that the populations themselves were cognitively static, but we have this huge problem with preservation bias, which is that stone that ancient is the only thing we have. We don't know what they were doing with wood, we don't know what they were doing with bamboo, bone, all this kind of stuff, right? So that's just kind of a long digression just to say that I'm appreciative of your overall thesis, but I just want to say that when you're talking artifacts, maybe this degree of resolution matters a lot more to me than it does to your overall argument. But I feel like for me, it doesn't nest quite as tidily as might be convenient.
In fact, I have a background in both philosophy and in anthropology, and I hear what you're saying, and I know that anthropologists, and for very good reasons, are very skeptical about implementing evolutionary theory to the study of cultural history or cultural diffusion. Like my take on that is like for me, accepting evolution means that there cannot be anything in this world that does not evolve. And I know that, for example, Kroeber, for example, he was very explicit in differentiating cultural evolution from what he then termed diffusion. And so he introduced a whole new vocabulary to think about change. Now, I think on a meta level, both of them, like for me, there is no difference between natural history and between natural change and evolution. For me, it's all the same. We just need to have a word to talk about it. And for me, that word is evolution. That's one point. And then in regard to the Acheulean tools, yes, it is true that there is discussion about whether or not there is stasis. But for example, if you look at the older one technology and at the Acheulean technology, you see that for many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, there is not much change in the shape of bifaces. They can diversify in length, but not so much in type. While if you look, for example, from the Middle Stone Age onwards, with the introduction of beads and strings, and then the boom, as it has been called and also debated with the Upper Paleolithic, you see that there is then a burst of creativity that, for example, you cannot find in Oldowan tools. But yes, there is, of course, a gap in the archaeological record as well. And yes, I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, Tomislav. You're muted.
Thanks. I said very interesting talk, and I'm anxious to hear what Carlos will have to say. So I have a very naive question, actually. You differentiate between units, levels, and mechanisms. So you seem to attach this level, okay, to ontology. It's a kind of ontological level. But why do you need that if you have units? I mean, units are entities. So it depends how you describe a unit, and you already have a level in a sense. What would you say to that? Am I wrong, or perhaps I don't see the real point of having a level?
I hear you, and well, this is modeled on how the modern synthesis thought about evolution. So, for the modern synthesis, the unit that evolves is the organism that evolves at the level of the environment by means of the mechanism of natural selection. So, the unit is what evolves, the level is where that evolution occurs, and then the mechanism is how evolution occurs. And I think that in itself can be universalized, and that is something that for me underlies my definition of evolution. I define evolution as that what occurs when units evolve at levels of an ontological hierarchy by mechanisms and processes. So for many years the modern synthesis understood let me stop sharing. For many years, the modern synthesis understood evolution as that what occurs by means of natural selection. And so because we have reticulate evolution and because we have evolution going faster and slower than the modern synthesis predicted, we need to think about how we can think about evolution in a more universal way. And for me, that universal way is something that we can still abstract from how the founders of the modern synthesis defined evolution, namely by looking for units, levels, and mechanisms. And that I think is also something that is being done within fields such as philosophy of biology, where you have debates on multi-level selection and also the study of reticulate evolution, where you find these studies today on these different mechanisms that underlie hybridization and lateral gene transfer. What you see there is that there is on a meta level a larger structure that can be considered universal, and that for me is these units, these levels, and these mechanisms. And then levels I think is important. Like a unit can be a level, but a level can also be a unit. So for example, when you say that a gene evolves at the level of, when an organism evolves at the level of the environment, that environment is something that can be broken down into many subunits, and the environment by itself also evolves. So you can say the environment, for example, is a level where evolution occurs, but the environment itself is also something that evolves. So there is an interchangeably, that's not the word I think, but so units and levels can be, there's a dynamic process. It's not only, the environment, for example, is not only a level where evolution occurs, it's also something that evolves itself. And I think there also we need to think about these static hierarchies in a much more dynamic way than that we have been doing so far.
So basically what you're saying is we can have the same unit evolving on two different levels.
Yes, and on multiple levels. And I think actually that is one of the questions that we need to raise now. We need to think more about hierarchy. So hierarchies used to be very like, you know, you have like the evolutionary hierarchy going from genes to organisms to species, for example. And then the organism was considered a unit and it evolves at the level of the environment. And so you already, and that's something that Niles Eldredge demonstrated, you already have a duality there. You, on the one hand, talk about a genealogical hierarchy, genes into organisms into species. But when you say that that organism evolves at the level of the environment, you're introducing the ecological hierarchy. So you have there a community. So you have organisms that form communities, that form larger ecological systems. So there you already have two hierarchies. And so based on that and thinking that idea through, the question is, well, how many hierarchies are there? And how do these units and levels interact? And sometimes, yeah, a unit can evolve at multiple levels. Sometimes also a unit can be a unit of evolution, while that unit at the same time is a level of evolution. That's also, for example, what we see with a holobiont. A holobiont is an organism plus its microbiome plus its virion, for example. But then that holobiont is also a habitable zone of life where bacterial communities evolve. While as an individual, it is also something that evolves by means of natural selection. So, you know, there is this dynamics that we need to start to get a grip on.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're out of time for that, but